Hello.
You still stink.
That was the class being nice. Okay, today we need to, everyone focus. Today we need to review the beast itself, Europe. Yes, the beast. It's like this. This is Europe, in case you didn't know. So we need to, yes. You know what annoys me? Europe is not actually a separate it shouldn't be a separate continent. Because this is all one like tectonic plate, so it shouldn't even be separate. But good old European arrogance. It's not Central Asia. You're not getting those points back. Let's talk about Europe. What is going on in Europe during Unit 1?
That's Middle East. Yeah.
So if we go back to the River Valley Civs, let's do a quick review of River Valley Civs. What are the 4 River Valley Civs?
Shang.
Okay, we have Shang. Good. We have Indus River Valley. Good. We have Meso. And Egypt. Right. So as we can see, they're not one of the primary river valleys. But how can we situate like the beginnings of peoples living in Europe? How do they get there? Where do they go from? Not initially. Where do all people hail?
Oh, Africa.
Good. So we actually begin here in East Africa and we move up. But how are we able to move up here? What allows for migration north? Well, yeah, agriculture. But before agriculture, what do we need to survive up north? Good. We need fur and we need what? Also an F word, but not that F word.
Food.
No.
Fire.
Yeah, fur and fire. It's cold up north, and we need to be able to survive up north. So until they develop stone tools that can butcher animals for furs, and until we develop fire, which is a long time ago, mind you, we don't see a lot of people migrate north. I think we see the first Europeans migrate in 250,000 BC. I believe that's about the time where we see them up there. And they settle in a lot of places. And then somebody mentioned the Caucasus before. These are the Caucasus Mountains here. Actually, I'm writing that wrong. Yes, this is where Caucasians come from.
Is that why?
That's why we call whites Caucasians, yes. Now, these people we refer to as Indo-Europeans. Technically, this is Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and Jordan, and southern Russia, and northern Turkey, yes. So we call these the Indo-Europeans. They're the same ones that splinter off into the Aryans, which eventually move down into India, but they also go off into Europe as groups like the Vandals, the Goths, the Angles, the Saxons, the Franks. Right, all those different groups that we'll talk about with Unit 2, Invasion of Rome. That's where they come from. So Indo-Europeans come from that region, and they splinter off and go in different groups. So early Europeans come from that stock. I didn't need to erase that. Okay. But you're right, nothing else is really going on. There's not a river valley civilization. We don't see a lot of early agricultural growth there. It's not until Unit 2 where we start to see Europe taking a larger role in world history. Tell me about Unit 2 Europe. What are some of the civilizations we talked about? All right, one of them are the Greeks. Tell me about the Greeks. Okay, yes, they are Greek. Good job, Gordon. 5 for you for the day. They are city-states. Would anybody remember the word for Greek city-states? It does start with a P.
Polis?
Hmm? Not provinces, polis.
Police?
But provinces was a very good guess. So polis, it's that Greek word that basically stands for city-states. The Greeks would not have identified themselves the Greeks. We only call them that after the fact because it denotes people that shared a culture. They would have called themselves Athenians or Spartans. Right? They are different. They don't see themselves as the same, but because they share a lot of cultural connections, we look back on them and call them the Greeks. They would never have called themselves the Greeks. Tell me, what else about the Greeks? So I already mentioned the main 2, and any other Greek would be annoyed about that, but the main 2 that we discussed are Athens and Sparta. What are some of the things that are Athenian?
Democracy.
Good. So we like to credit democracy as being Athenian, but that's actual democracy. We don't have actual democracy. We're more of a republic. Where individual people, it's like the popular vote. Individual people vote for things, majority wins. What else? Architecture, yes. There's a lot of specific architecture. Tell me about their religion.
Polytheistic.
They are not, but the Persians are. So they are polytheistic in nature. They believe in a pantheon of gods, the head of which, well, there's a lot, but Zeus generally, right? And then there's 14 main deities, and then there's dozens of like lesser deities in Greek religion. What else can you tell me about the Greeks? About the Athenians in particular, though? Their navy, good. They are known for having a very strong navy, and we'll talk about some of the conflicts shortly. How about the Spartans? What's their claim to fame? Right. They are powerful fighters. They have a better, what we would identify as an army. Their religion? Yeah, it's the same. It's the same religion. They believe in the same gods. They probably would have honored the god of war, though, more so than the Athenians. Yeah, Ares is the god of war. Or Artemis, who was like the female equivalent. She was, she was an archer. She was really cool, too. Or Athena, she's also a god. There's a lot of war gods. That makes sense. The Spartans weren't exactly known for the democracy of their architecture, but what could you tell me about Athenian Spartan politics?
They had a king.
Good.
They had another.
They had a king, but they also have something we can identify as an oligarchy, which is where a handful of men will make all the decisions, because remember they had like a council of elders and the ephors that would make a lot of decisions. So we're looking at two city-states that we would consider Greek, yet there are a lot of differences between them, right? So we have to kind of look at them at face value. We may identify them as both being Greek, particularly that they're both in modern-day Greece. However, they would have seen themselves as very different entities. But because they're close together, we like to lump them together. Now, who did the Greeks fight? There were two different wars that we looked at. All right, the first, good, you guys went in order, chronological. The first would be the Persians. The Persians would have existed more or less here.
Oh, because it looks like a pea?
Nope. These would have been Persian lands over here, including where I scribbled. Tell me about the Persian War. It was crazy. Thank you, Selma.
I mean, Darius.
They be fighting. Thank you. Some of them were. So there were four main battles. I'm not going to recount them all because I don't want to spend too much time on this. But it was essentially a war between Persians and Greeks over what? Land. Because every war ever is over land. If your answer is land, then you're correct. So it was a war over land. But who came in contact with who? Like, who was expanding their territory?
Persians.
Good. The Persians were expanding
And then some
west.
province like revolted against them.
Mm-hmm.
And they got help from the Greeks.
So the Persians are expanding west. They go into basically modern-day Anatolia. It's the Mediterranean side of Turkey, right? There were Greek settlements there called the Ionian Greeks. The Persians took it. There was a struggle. The Athenians backed the Greeks that were living there. They got into war with each other over territorial expansion. Long story short, who wins the Persian War? The Greeks win, but at great cost, right? A lot of them were suffering because of it. A lot of them did die also. But that allows the Greeks eventually kind of get into power with each other. What was the name of, get into war with each other? What was that war called? Good. The Peloponnesian War, which two main city-states at war with each other? Good. And long story short, who wins? Sparta. Yeah, technically nobody, but I mean, Sparta destroys Athens, but both of them are severely weakened, and who comes down and conquers everyone? Excellent. The Macedonians under Alexander the Great. This is what we call Hellenistic Greece, right? It's a Greece where Alexander the Great conquers, and then he goes and he conquers Persia, and he makes this massive empire, and he names like 27 towns after him. I'm not kidding. There are a lot of Alexandrias. Yes. And right, and they named one city Bucephalus after Alexander's horse. I don't know why his name was Bucephalus, but that's what it was. Who was the other large European power that we haven't talked about yet? Rome. Yeah, we can't really ignore the Romans. Romans take up a whole lot of this. Now, Rome has several stages. Let me color in some of Rome. Rome at its height goes all the way up to the borders of Scotland. They take over Spain, northern Africa, and Egypt. Rome at its height is all of this, which at the time and when we were looking at maps was a lot. It doesn't hold a candle to the Mongols, right? But it was still a pretty large empire. And when we look at the Romans, there are two main periods of time. The first is the Republic, and the second is Empire. Good. Does anybody happen to remember any of the dates for any of these things, beginning or end?
They fell in 476.
The Empire falls in 476 CE when the Goths invade and then the Huns invade after them.
That's the only date I know.
That's fine. The Republic begins in 509 BCE. It ends in 27 BCE, and that's when the empire begins. It goes that way. Now, who was the first emperor of Rome in 27 BCE?
Augustus?
Good. The person that kind of links all this together for us is Augustus. He used to have a different name, though. Does anybody remember it? Octavian. Good. He was part of that second triumvirate. At some point, he wasn't. All right. It was the second triumvirate. He takes the name Augustus. It links more to the family. Augustus Caesar. Caesar's a title. He becomes the first emperor of Rome when clearly the Republic had crumbled and fallen apart. And he's like, forget this, single ruler system, empire go. Now, during the Republic phase, Rome had they had a lot of fights, but they had this one epic, legendary battle over territory, and we talked about them yesterday. Who did the Romans fight?
Carthaginians.
Good. The Carthaginians, who were North African. Good, and that's like we talked about yesterday with Hannibal with his elephants, and they destroyed them. Bye, Carthage. I'm going to scratch you out. And that land became Roman. At its height, the Roman Empire kind of spanned all the way up to the borders of Scotland, northern Africa, the Middle East, the old Persian Empire, a good chunk of Europe. And a lot of that land we can still uncover Roman artifacts, which is really cool also. But eventually Rome falls for many reasons, but it falls in 476. And tell me what Europe looks like after that period. Right. It becomes decentralized. The only James, thank you for pointing that out. The only group that survives and stays centralized and carries on the Roman torch, so to speak, would be what we describe as the Byzantine Empire. You may remember in around the year 300 with Constantine, they split the empire in half. Or rather, Constantine puts it back together, but Dionysius divides. Nope. Diocletian divides. Dionysius is a god. Diocletian divides the empire in half. And what persists over here is the Byzantine Empire. They just call themselves Romans because they always were Romans, but we identify them as the Byzantine. They survive until 1453 with the fall of the Byzantine Empire. So they're still there. Who else develops in Europe in this period of time? A bunch of Viking traders. Good. This is also, we're going to include Russia in our conversation about Europe, by the way. So we also see over here, I did something. Oh, goodness. We see a group pop up called the Kievan Rus. Rasha, what's up?
When did the Byzantine Empire fail?
The Byzantine Empire started around 330 until 1453. Who conquered the Byzantine Empire?
The Ottomans.
Yeah, the Ottomans, the Seljuk Turks, right? So they were around for a really long time. So if you look at Roman history, the Roman Republican Empire was about 1,000 years. The Byzantine were also a little more than 1,000 years. So collectively, it's like 1,500 years of Roman history, which is quite a lot. It's probably why Europe loves them so much. So this is what's going on in Eastern Europe. But what's going on in Western Europe? And you guys already kind of said it, but say it again.
Mess.
Good. It's a mess. It becomes decentralized, right? Instead of seeing one empire ruling over all of them, it breaks away into the smaller groups. The Franks take over the area that is France. The Goths kind of settle in Spain. Other Germanic tribes kind of settle in what is today Germany and Poland and areas like that. But it's divided for a while. But it does eventually kind of come together and coalesce into something. Does anybody remember which group takes over power, allies itself with the Christian church to create a new empire?
Holy Roman.
Yes, but not the Anglo-Saxons. They're chilling up in England. The Franks.
Oh,
All right. We see the Franks. They come to power. It begins with a guy called Clovis,
Yeah.
who in 496 allies himself with the church.
Yeah. That's when Rome.
It's a little bit after Rome falls. Yeah, he allies himself with the church because he wants to pick up what Rome has now lost, which is a centralized government. Now, meanwhile, it's basically just France. But over time, they're going to start invading and taking over more lands, and it will eventually become the Holy Roman Empire. So Clovis starts picking up, but it's not until the 700s do we start to see them really rise as an empire, when expanding his lands, Charles the Hammer Martel, the Hammer, Charles the Hammer Martel, starts to expand, and he fights the Battle of Tours. Who is that against?
Invading
Good. At the same time, and we'll talk about this when we do the Middle East tomorrow, at the same time, in the Middle East, we've got the rise of Islam. Islam becomes more of a thing in the 620s when Muhammad brings it down to Mecca, conquers Mecca, and makes it the one religion. And after that, the Umayyads engage in this like campaign of spreading Islam, and they had made it all the way up here. Remember, the Umayyads had a really large empire. The Abbasids were the ones focused on territorial expansion or on cultural expansion, but the Umayyads were all about territorial expansion. And so it starts to make its way into modern-day Spain, and the Franks meet them about here-ish at the Battle of Tours. Who wins, the Franks or the Umayyads?
The hammer.
The Franks. The hammer wins, essentially creating a cultural boundary. This is where Christianity ends, this is where Islam ends, and it kind of creates in Spain this like dual religion, but like this is the end of your expansion. You're not going any further past this. Spain remains this way, kind of fractured until the 1400s, when about the same time that Columbus is exploring, the Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain, the king and queen who unite Spain, work to push out the Muslims. We call it Reconquista. They basically went around and kicked the Muslims out. But that's uniform. So the Franks kind of maintain the barrier, and what ends up happening is we create a Frankish kingdom that ends up being all of this, and you guys said it before, the Holy Roman Empire.
So holy, so Roman.
Yeah, not holy and not Roman, but it kind of the leader, or rather the most well-known leader of the Holy Roman Empire in 800 CE was Charlemagne. My nephew is named after him, kind of, accidentally. Charlemagne. No, his name's not Charlie. They named him Magnus, which is a Latin word that means great. Nope. That's a magnum. But Magnus also means great. They use it up in Iceland. The strongest man in the world is Magnus Magnusson. I'm not kidding. Greatness.
Greatness. Wow, what a great name.
It is great. Yeah, it's very Magnus. So Charlemagne becomes the most well-known leader. He pushes literacy. He encourages people to explore, right? And so we start to see a rise of literacy, because otherwise what we see is not a lot. But that's kind of like the first phase of European history. Unit 3 goes from 600 to 1450. And what's the more dominant pattern of European history in this period of time? What do we see the rise of? Feudalism. All right. Much of Western Europe, Byzantine and Kievan Rus are still doing their thing. But the main pattern of interaction we see start to build here is a feudal system. Can somebody explain to me how the feudal system works? All right, so peasants work for knights. The knights offer protection to the lords who give them the land. And what do the lords do? Right, they pay homage to the king and, money. And in return, the king gives land to the lords, who gives a small amount of land to the knights, who gives a tiny amount of land they don't actually own to the peasants. And it's this reciprocal system where everybody gives and receives and helps each other out. What it also creates is a solid manor. Everybody lives on the manor. Everybody contributes to the manor system. There's no real reason to leave the manor because everything you need is there. And so it creates small, isolated pockets. And while there is some trade between some manors, generally speaking, trade in the West stops. During the Roman Empire, they engaged in trade on the Silk Roads, all the way with China, and it was great. And Romans had access to a lot of things from the Middle East, from India, and from China. But that kind of goes away during the feudal system, because now you don't really need to trade for goods anymore. So we don't generally see that. What are some of the technological advances of the feudal era in Western Europe?
3 fields.
Good. First, a 3-field system. If I've got a field, it's not going to look this simple. One of the fields I'm going to leave empty, so it can regenerate. One of the fields I'm going to plant one type of crop, like wheat. It looks strangely like my Chinampa diagram, but that's fine. It looks like wheat. And then the other field I'm going to use for either another crop or maybe animal grazing, depends on what I've got. Like barley or something. But what they would, so by leaving one field empty, it allows the soil to regenerate its nutrients so it can be used once again. So that was a good advancement. You guys already mentioned the plows. Remember the ridiculous name for it? Mold board. It was not a board, and it was not moldy, but it was called the mold board. Now, what made the mold board unique? It was a plow, right? But what was special about it?
You could attach to an animal.
Yeah, but all plows could.
better than usual?
Always made of
Iron?
Good. So it had iron on like the front of it. Imagine if it was like your shoe, the top part of your shoe would be dipped in iron basically. So pulling through the ground, it could do a lot more work and dig a lot deeper, and it was a lot more effective. So this is using metallurgy and the things that we have access to better agricultural technology. Just one of the few advancements we see in early medieval Europe. In later medieval Europe, there are a lot of advancements in culture, in technologies like the printing press, right, in sailing technologies. In later medieval Europe, it's a lot different. But in early medieval Europe, like 800s, 900s, we don't see that much growth in technology. The other one was the horse collar. It's just another way of controlling a horse.
Wait, who was the lion that could actually roar, but wasn't actually the lion roaring statue?
Those were the Byzantines. Yeah, the Byzantines used a lot of physics, actually. So they would use a lot of hydraulic engines, and they would create a lot of machines based off of gravity and water that would make statues come to life and roar and do all kinds of things. It was really cool. Technology has a really long and interesting history. It doesn't just begin with the scientific revolution. But the Byzantines had a lot of really cool technology also, which was great. So the West stays feudal for a long time, but sometime in the 1300s, everything starts to change for them. What happens in the mid-1300s that changes the course of political and social Europe? Yay, the plague. So the plague begins probably on the border of Mongolia, China. Did you guys read that article I sent out about the couple who got sick with marmots? You should read it. It's good. Well, right. Well, that's the problem. So there's this ancient proverb that marmots, if a marmot is sick, you stay away from it. A marmot is like a small rodent-y, prairie dog-looking, gerbily thing. But they're prized for their furs. And in Mongolian indigenous medicine, eating raw marmot is also a cure of some sort. Right? So it's indigenous medicine. So a couple recently ate raw marmot, both the offal meat, that's like the organ meat, and just raw, I don't know if it was breast or thigh meat, but they ate raw marmot and they got sick because it was carrying plague, which is really cool. And they didn't go to a doctor, so they died of plague. So just so you know, like the ancient Black Death is still very much around and kicking. Well, they believed it was indigenous medicine and that they would be saved. That's one of the clashes we see in the world with the rise of like Western science is the clash between Western medicine and indigenous medicine. And it doesn't mean that indigenous medicine doesn't work, but there's a lot of clash between them. But we do know scientifically that marmots can carry plague, and eating raw marmot means you could get plague. Unfortunately, that happened. So we think that something similar happens here. Modern-day historians don't actually think it's the black rat. We think it's probably other things like the marmot who spread plague from those regions to the west. There is another plague center, though. It's down here between China and India. That's also a very endemic area, a plague pool, we call it, where a lot of plague exists naturally. Remember, plague is bacteria. They don't need a host to survive. They can live on their own. They usually live in colonies of rodents, though. But we think that plague actually came from, or at least the Black Death plague, came from the Chinese-Mongolian border. So from a long period of time, from 1333, when we get a very early case of it on Issyk Kul. Issyk Kul, it's a lake kind of over here. Come on, hold on, it's lagging.
The lag.
There's a lake over here called Issyk Kul, and that's one of the first recorded cases of plague, and it spreads its way, and it impacts India too, and it spreads its way to the Middle East, and talk about death here, and it eventually gets to Kaffa. From Kaffa, sailors flee, they go down here, and they go to Italy, and they bring it to Italy. From Italy, it spreads basically to the rest of Europe. Anywhere between, I've heard all kinds of estimates, but it's generally accepted that up to a third of the populations of many European cities died. And it really changed the social system, because this old system of relying on the peasants for the labor doesn't work anymore if most of the peasants are dead. Because there's nobody there to do the labor. And the remaining peasants who survived are now going to bargain for more rights and more pay in order to do all the extra labor. So it really destroys the feudal system. There's no way feudalism can survive this. And so it goes away. And instead we start to get the beginnings of a state-run economic system that's going to become the mercantilism we recognize with the Atlantic slave trade. I'm jumping a lot there, but, as we do. So let's talk about Unit 4, then. Unit 4 is from 1450 to 1750, and this is when Europe really starts to take the power and become this hegemonic, this like dominant force throughout the world, right? What happens in Europe? Well, what are the big? There's like 3 or 4 main events that happen in this period of time. Okay, well, that's one of them. I'm talking periods, but in terms of actual events, the fall of Constantinople is a really big one. This was a fall of a Christian city, and with it, it encouraged the Europeans to go through Constantine. What did I just write? The fall of Constantinople kind of spurred some changes in Europe. What did it directly lead to? Europeans can't trade that way anymore, so trade over the sea. What do we call that? Nope, before that, the age of?
Exploration.
Good. So first we see the age of exploration, where we've got explorers like Christopher Columbus who decide to go sail in the opposite direction, lands into a new continent group. Yes, this is where we start to see the rise of parliamentary monarchies and absolute monarchies. We'll talk about that in a second, though. After the age of exploration, there's also more of like a cultural, artistic change in Europe. What do we identify that as? Before we get there, a Renaissance. So I'll come to you with that in a little bit. Then we have the Renaissance. So with the age of exploration, we start to see Europeans exploring and going out around the world. The Portuguese make their way around Africa to India and open up the spice trade. The spice trade makes Europeans immensely wealthy. Right? It also opens them up to the rest of the world that they had not been trading with for a while during the earlier part of the Middle Ages. It also puts them in contact with the New World. And when they start to build colonies over in the New World, they're going to become immensely rich off that also. Having all of this extra stuff allows them to engage in this kind of cultural, I shouldn't use the word enlightening, so awakening, right? This cultural awakening. Artistically, they start to rely on ancient Greek and Roman things. They get the printing press, they start to become more literate, they start to write, they create things. A little bit more time is devoted to culture. Because the feudal system is over and they have that extra time now to be able to engage in culture. Also, opening themselves back up to the East puts them in contact with cultures and art and literature and music that they haven't come in contact with for a very long time. Another thing starts to build, though, in Europe, despite the fact that the church is the bastion of education, people are also starting to open up their minds to what? Science, right? This is the birth of the scientific revolution.
Bacon.
Yes, Francis Bacon. This is the birth of the scientific revolution. We've got men like Francis Bacon who come up with the scientific method. Isaac Newton, gravity, laws of motion. Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo, movement of planets, planetary motion. Right? But then we've also got a guy named René Descartes, not Descartes. René Descartes. And what does he come up with? Skepticism. Skepticism. That we should be skeptical of everything we learn. You should never take what you learn at face value. You should always be skeptical and try to understand it for itself. What if we apply that to our social system? What if we apply that to the absolute and parliamentary monarchs? Should we have to get ruled by a king? Or should people have more say in government? And that leads to what Marty told us was the Enlightenment. The principles of questioning that we get in the scientific revolution are going to be applied to the Enlightenment, which allows us to start questioning things like equality, liberty, governance, and how people fit into this equation. And that is going to cause a lot of the changes that we see happening in Unit 4 with revolutions, the way we interact with other people, the way that we feel. So the Enlightenment, although a very good thing, also leads to a lot of negative changes that we're going to see in Europe also. I'm skipping over a lot, obviously, but these are the main things that connect us to Unit 4. These 4 periods of time: the Age of Exploration, the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment. It's during this period of time also that we start to see globalizing trade networks, 4.1, right? What is the new part of world trade? How does it become opened up and proto-globalized? Europe's trading with who now? Everybody, but newly the Americas. Right, for the first time they're trading with the Americas, which is new for them, and it allows them to become immensely wealthy. Right, it provides them with raw materials from a place that they'd never been to before. They use those raw materials for manufacturing. They sell the manufactured goods back to their colonies, but also to Africa in exchange for slaves and gold, and they make a killing. So as Europe is going through this age of enlightenment, mostly throughout the 1700s, that brings us into Unit 5. Unit 5 is from 1750 to 1900. What's going on in Europe between 1750 and 1900?
The Reformation.
The Reformation's a little... So the Reformation actually belongs back in Unit 4.
Oh.
Hold on. So the Reformation actually goes in about here-ish. The Reformation is when we get the printing press and we start to become literate and we read things like the Bible and we understand that the way the Catholic Church is practicing is not the way the Bible is written. And because people can actually read the Bible now because they're literate, they're starting to call out some of the malpractice they see in the Catholic Church. Who was the German priest who kind of spearheaded this? Martin Luther, right? Martin Luther stands up to the Catholic Church, says your principles are wrong, and that's where we see a fracture in the church, where we see... yeah, all kinds of things. No, that's before. All kinds of like Protestantism and baptism and Calvinism and all these things kind of branch out. Also, I'm glad we came back here. We neglected Eastern Europe. So while all of this is going on in Western Europe, what's happening in Russia?
Well, the Mongols were there, but now they're golden.
Good. In 1462, Ivan III, also known as Ivan the Great, declares Russia free from Mongol control. The Mongols by this point had really receded back to Mongolia and had been kicked out of China. They're no longer the empire in China. So they're gone. So Russia kind of begins here. And Ivan starts this campaign of territorial expansion. So first it begins with Ivan. He gets all of this territory here. His successor, Ivan the Terrible, it's a terrible name, gets a little bit more lands. But he left without any heirs, right? He killed all of his sons and any potential rivals to the throne, so when he dies, there's nobody to take over. And that's where we see a transition of power to the Romanov family, who's going to stay in power until the Communist Revolution in 1917. After that, in order, we get all kind of Romanovs, Michael and Alexis Romanov, but the important ones after that are Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Yeah, Peter wanted to westernize. So Peter first invades this area, Poland and all of this, so that he can get a seaport. It's called St. Petersburg. And he also gets a good chunk of this land here and also starts moving south a little bit. It's Catherine who actually expands that and gets all of this. Right, and Alaska that way also. And manages to get all of that territory. So during this period of time is when we start to see the territorial expansion that leads to the Russia we know today. In Unit 5, Russia is still expanding. They're not industrial yet, although they will get there at the very end of the 1900s. Right? This is when we start to see the Russian Revolution happening. But I want to talk about Russian, it seems weird, but I'll talk about Russian industrialization more when we talk about Japan, because the two of them have a really interesting industrial relationship, not to mention they went to war against each other. So Russia's over here still industrializing and catching up. What's happening in Western Europe in 1750?
French Revolution.
Mm-hmm. One of the big ones is the French Rev. The French use the principles of the Enlightenment, and they say, why do we have a king who claims to be the son of a god? Right? Who is this King Louis XIV, and who is this King Louis XVI, and why do they have all of the power? And the Enlightenment says that we're all equal, and yet I don't see equality. It went down to this estate system. They had the first estate, which were the clergy, members of the church. Then they had a second estate, the Estates Generales, which is the nobility. And then they had the third estate, which was literally everyone else. Whether you are a rich merchant, whether you are a peasant, doesn't matter. You're all in the same estate. And they saw this, long story short, they saw this as a huge example of inequality. They were overly taxed by the rich. Only the poor paid taxes, the rich didn't. The rich collected directly from their taxes, and they didn't have to pay any taxes, and they didn't have to work either. They just had money. And the third estate, exactly, the third estate saw this as ridiculous. This doesn't make sense. The Enlightenment has taught us that all men should be equal and that men should have a say in government. Rebellion happens, right? It's helpful that the Americans had rebelled first in 1776. It had been done successfully. They separated themselves from a monarch who was ruling over them, and the French are like, hey, we can do that too. So in 1789, we see the French Revolution. It lasts 10 years, and even though eventually it is a failure, because they do bring a king back in power a little bit later on, what it does do for the world is show that Enlightenment ideas are supreme and that they could spread and should spread to other places. For example, the French Revolution allows the Haitians to rebel. The French Revolution also encourages rebellions in Germany, in Prussia, in Austria-Hungary, in a whole bunch of places. Don't think Greece. But a whole bunch of other places in Europe also experience revolutions of sort. We call them the revolutions of 1848. They're not successful, but it's an attempt to show that politics and society is changing. And this is the birth of three different groups. We've got the conservatives, who want to maintain what? Yeah, status quo. Let's keep the monarchs. Let's go back to the way it was. Let's make Europe great again. And then you've got the liberals, who want some change. They're basically our founding fathers. They want white men with land, basically, to be able to vote. And then we got those crazy radicals. They're very Athenian, though, aren't they? The radicals want, like, equality for everyone. Yeah, everybody should have a right to vote, regardless of if you own land or not. It's much more democratic. All of the revolutions, by the way, were radical revolutions. That's why they all failed. Too much, too soon, right? But what we start to see instead is the rise of liberals in Europe, and I would argue that Europe kind of stays liberal up until the present day. So revolutions are really what are dictating this, but there's two other, before we finish for the day, there's two other really big things that happen in this period, which change the way that Europe interacts with everybody else in the world, and they are what?
Imperialism.
How does imperialism happen? What comes first?
Industrialization.
Good. First, we have the rise of the industrial revolution. And having this technology allows them to engage in imperialism, which is when they divide up Africa, which we looked at yesterday. Having the technology to get into Africa means that they can get into Africa, and they want its natural resources to run its factories. So with the growth in technology and the growth in power and this political freedom that they're now enjoying, we also start to notice the birth of the Industrial Revolution, first in Britain, then the mainland. And with industrialization, which happens first in Europe, they're able to be the first ones to engage in imperialism. They're not the only ones. Japan does it later, right? But they engage in imperialism, and that completely changes the way that they interact with the rest of the world. Unit 6 we'll talk about very briefly tomorrow, but essentially what happens in Unit 6 is they go through a lot of world wars. There's a lot of competition with each other. Being imperial puts them against each other once again, conflict for land. World War I happens, World War II happens, the Cold War happens, and in the modern day, Europe is still trying to get along with each other, with groups like the European Union being parties of like the United Nations. But Europe is still very fractured, and a lot of that goes back to World War I. In fighting each other for lands, they destroy this relationship they had of going out and taking over the world. And instead of looking outwards to take over the rest of the world, they're now looking inwards and taking over each other.